3, 2, 1.
Frank, thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me, Peyton.
Absolutely. So, I want to start off with a story about how I found your book. I was at a buddy's wedding, and towards the end of summer, early fall, and we were taking pictures at Tom's Town, the local distillery, and me being naive, I didn't know what the hell Tom's Town was or who was Tom. And then someone said Tom Pendergast. Okay, I've heard of that name. And there was another patron in the bar restaurant area, and he's like, "Yeah, you need to check out the book, The Mafia and The Machine. They're gonna make a movie out of it one day, and it's all about the Kansas City Mafia, and there's really nothing else like it out there." And living and growing up in Kansas City and having business here, very passionate, lived all over the city, and loved this place. And I started the book in the fall and finished it pretty quickly. It was an amazing read, super factual, and you talking about the parts and of the city and all drawing the connections was pretty amazing. I really enjoyed that process, and I just want to thank you for you taking the time to write this book and go through that journey of creating a book like this.
Well, I thank you very much. I'm very flattered, and I appreciate that. You mentioned connections, and that's what really piqued my interest in this topic is the connections.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about organized crime, when you're talking about the mafia, it's all about connections.
Yeah.
One thing connects to another, one individual connects to another, the families connect to each other, the cities connect to each other, and it's this intricate web of intrigue that is just endlessly fascinating.
When did you become fascinated with it?
Well, my family goes way back in Kansas City, several generations. In fact, my great-grandfather is in this book, Men Who Are Making Kansas City. William Patrick Hayde, he was a bricklayer from a family of 10 Irish Catholics. And he and some of his brothers, in fact, built the Loretto Academy, that building on 39th Street, beautiful red brick building. If you look at it today, the brickwork is just still beautiful, not a crack in it. But anyway, I digress. But my father is 92 years old. His memory actually goes back to Pendergast. He remembers Tom Pendergast. And so when I was growing up, he talked about some of those events that happened back in those days, and that kind of piqued my interest. And then later, I started a career with the National Park Service, and one of my assignments was at the Harry Truman National Historic Site in Independence, Missouri. And I had to learn a lot of local history working there. I learned about Harry Truman's connection to Tom Pendergast, the political machine in Kansas City. So I learned first about the machine, and then that eventually led to the mafia. Later on, I started reading about the mafia in New York, in Chicago, other cities, and I sort of became addicted to that subject matter. Because again, the connections, you read one book and it connects to the next book and it connects to the next book and so on. But there was this big missing link, and that was Kansas City. Nobody had written a book about the Kansas City Mafia. And so I said, well, someone's got to do it. So,
what year was this when you started getting really intrigued with it? You started doing serious research.
Okay, I really started the book in earnest probably about 2002, 2003. It was published in 2007.
Okay.
So it took me about 4 years to write.
Because that's what, 10 years after a bunch of the Italian mafia movies like Casino
At
and
least,
Godfather.
yeah, it was quite a while after those, yeah.
Okay, because there's and a lot of those movies, there's always Kansas City gets dropped once or twice in those movies.
Right.
Like, what? Okay. And so, at what point did you say, all right, I'm going to write a book about this?
Yeah. Yeah, again, I think it was, I had seen Casino, and I had heard the references to Kansas City, and I knew some of that, those stories, and everybody who grew up here heard, whisperings and, a few little things about maybe what happened out in Las Vegas in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, but it was after I had probably read about in the early part of this century. I was just addicted to this reading material for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And after I'd read probably 10 or 12 books on mafia families in other cities,
Mm-hmm.
I just realized that this was a fascinating story, what happened right here in Kansas City. Every bit as interesting as Chicago, New York, or any of the other mafia cities. And I started looking for information. What's out there? I want to learn more about the Kansas City mob. But there just wasn't much out there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, well, I'll be the one to step up and see if I can do this.
How did you what was your biggest source of information about the Kansas City Mafia?
Well, a lot of obscure books, old out-of-print books, a lot of court documents, legal documents,
So there's not.
old newspaper
right.
articles, things like that.
You were piecing stories together, timelines together,
Right.
through various different sources.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
And why is it called The Machine?
So the machine refers to the political machine here in Kansas City, and machine politics was a system of government, really, that flourished in the late 19th century and on into the at least middle part of the 20th century. I suppose you could say there's remnants of political machines still operating in some cities today. And this was really as interesting to me as the Mafia was. Again, Tom Pendergast, Harry Truman. This was some history that I knew quite a bit about, having worked at the Harry Truman home. And so the machine was a word used to describe these political organizations that were started generally by Irish immigrants, Irish Americans, who started out poor, started out in poverty. They faced a lot of economic hardship and a lot of discrimination in the various cities that they emigrated to from Ireland. And by inserting themselves into politics, they discovered that they could flourish and help themselves and their families and their neighbors prosper. So it was a different way of doing business. It was initially the earlier machines here in Kansas City, at least the earliest machine, which was led by Jim Pendergast, Tom's older brother, was relatively clean compared to what it became under Tom Pendergast, when it became literally this juggernaut of corruption. But if you can understand political machines and if you can understand organized crime, you can understand your city a lot better. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's one of the most interesting things about reading about the Mafia. I was never interested in true crime. Mm-hmm. I'm not interested in serial killers. I'm not interested in blood and gore. Mm-hmm. None of that stuff. For me, it's about city life, and it's about learning about labor unions and politics and business and sports and all the elements that make a great city. Organized crime intertwines with all of those things.
Yeah.
And so the Mafia is a great prism, by which to view a city.
And Tom, was he the one at the turn of the century that was getting established in the West Bottoms?
That was actually Jim. Well, Jim started out in the West Bottoms in the late 19th century, really in the Wild West era. Yeah. I mean, Jim Pendergast was contemporaneous with Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok.
It sounded like it was just a saloon town.
Right.
And there was no infrastructure, there was no police enforcement. Like these guys, it was a brothel and a gambling joint and a beer joint every other store.
Right. And that's true. I mean, there was some heavy industry there. The stockyards were flourishing at that time. So it was a growing, dynamic city when Jim Pendergast got here. But it was still had one foot definitely in the Wild West era, you know. But for sure, the environment down in the West Bottoms, especially at that time, is just like you said, saloons,
Yeah.
bawdy houses.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Jim was a saloon keeper. That was his profession.
Yeah. Well, this table, we bought this in the West Bottoms.
Okay.
So there's a little homage.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your dad, who's still alive. He's 92, and he knew Jim or Tom.
Well, he didn't know Tom personally, but my dad was a boy when Pendergast was at his peak.
Does he have any wild stories? One or two specific stories that stand out to you?
Regarding Tom Pendergast, his stories,
or just
Yeah.
that time in general.
well, to hear my dad tell it, the way it was all about who you knew. And if, for instance, you maybe did something you shouldn't have been doing and you got pinched by the police, if you could drop the right name, then, maybe you'd just kind of get shoot along and say, okay, young man, go home, instead of getting arrested.
Yeah.
Things like that. Maybe if you were looking for a job, young man, fresh out of college looking for a job, you would go and shake hands with people that knew your family, knew your father, knew your mother, your sister, whoever. So, and that's the way the machine operated. It was all about human connection. It was all about who you knew and doing favors for each other. We've since gotten away from that, more towards meritocracy, where if you're qualified or you're not. But back then, these type of connections really meant a lot. And so in a way, he was always kind of nostalgic for those days because, we were Irish Catholic Democrats, and Tom Pendergast was an Irish Catholic Democrat. In fact, Tom Pendergast came from Tipperary, Ireland, which is the same town where my family is from. So those types of connections could make a difference for a young guy back in those days.
Yeah.
But this was all before World War II, of course. So stories like that, and my father's of an age when anybody my father's age who grew up in Kansas City probably would have had some type of experience with mobsters at some point. Maybe it was just a brief handshake over a real estate deal or something. Who knows? It could have been anything. But they were just so much a part of the city for so long that you really couldn't live here. You couldn't really grow up here and live your life here without intersecting with them on some level.
Do you think that they helped the progression in a good way for the infrastructure of Kansas City?
Well, I think you could argue that some of the policies of the machine helped Kansas City. I think you could argue that. I'm sure people could argue against that also. Jim Pendergast, for example, throwing his support behind various infrastructure projects, building of a park, moving Union Station from the West Bottoms to where it is now. I see the picture right behind you there.
Yeah.
Things like that. The Mafia, well, that's different. I think that some people would say that they benefited from their Mafia connections, even though they weren't mobsters. Maybe they were in business and they got a good real estate deal from the right guy who was connected to the right guy, that kind of thing. So I think they did help a lot of individuals in certain ways. Whether they helped the city as a whole or not, probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, they're crooks, they're criminals, and they take.
Yeah. So you're piecing all these things together. There's nothing even remotely close to what you put into this book. While you're going through this process, are you having any thought of, okay, well, why hasn't anyone written or talked about this? Am I exposing something that shouldn't be exposed?
I did. I wondered, why hasn't anybody done this yet? And I think the answer was it was just a little too soon. I think until that time, it was just too early. There was just still too much danger, maybe, too much concern that this was all still too fresh.
Yeah.
And
because in your book, there was, a handful of the old school Mafia guys left, and they were in their 80s and 90s.
Right.
So,
yeah. And they've got sons and grandsons, you know, and the organization is still here. It's still active to a much lesser degree than it was during the time period that I wrote about. But there is a remnant of a mafia here for sure.
Yeah.
And so, sure, I think some people probably were scared off by that. My feeling at the time was it's been long enough. My book, the main events in my book end in about the mid-'80s.
Mm-hmm.
In the paperback version, there is a brief afterword that kind of catches the reader up with some stuff that was happening pretty recently, you know, just 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Some gambling cases, internet gambling, and that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Remember you talking about that.
But for the most part, the history that I wrote about ended in the mid-'80s, late '80s, and most of the players were dead.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not writing anything that hadn't already been documented somewhere else.
Yeah.
It might have been documented in a book. It might have been documented in a news article. It might have been documented in an indictment.
Mm-hmm.
But it was documented.
Yeah.
I was not uncovering any new information that was going to implicate anybody in anything that they hadn't already been implicated in. So I felt pretty comfortable.
Yeah. And, you know, there's so many remnants of that time, which is a great thing. It's really cool for us to look back and kind of, I don't know, fantasize about nowadays. But, you know, one of the recent things that I was thinking about was they federally legalized sports betting. Mm-hmm. And I saw that both in Kansas and Missouri, just in January of this year, they're both pushing to have sports betting shops in both states. And then, you know, obviously we have some pretty intricate rules with our riverboats and how that all got established. Can you dive in and talk about the start and the beginning of the riverboats and the gambling here?
Well, you know, Kansas City was always a gambling town, and that goes back to the late 19th century. Again, Jim Pendergast was, you know, after he opened his saloons, he opened gambling halls, and you know, people would come to Kansas City specifically to gamble, as tourists, like they might go to Las Vegas today. It was all illegal, but it was just happening everywhere, all over town, out in the county, in the city. And then Las Vegas, of course, was really, I won't say it was created by the mafia, but they were in very early, and they did sort of mold it into what it is today. They, you know, you could say that they really kind of created modern Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And Kansas City was a big part of that. You know, the Sevillas, by the time we're getting up into the 60s and 70s, the Sevillas were in charge of the family here, and they had strong connections in Las Vegas, concealed ownership in several casinos, and then, of course, the famous straw man case, which is sort of what the movie Casino was based on. That all came from FBI wiretaps here in Kansas City, where the FBI overheard Carl DeLuna talking about these mysterious things, using code language, but they were able to figure out what he was talking about. They were listening in to try to get information on some murders that had happened. And all of a sudden they started hearing these code words about clearly things that were happening in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And that really blew up this case and really uncovered the extent to which the mafia was involved in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And the amount of money that they were skimming from casinos. You know, there was the Black Book in Las Vegas, which listed people that were banned from even entering a casino. The original Black Book, I think, was 11 people. So it was such a small group. The implication was that, hey, these are the most serious, you know, dangerous guys that are, you know, that can potentially do the most damage to honest, you know, gaming mobsters in the state. They were all mobsters. Yeah. And 3 of the 11 were from Kansas City.
Wow.
You know, Nick Sevilla, Carl Sevilla, and Max Jabin. And then later with the Missouri riverboats, you know, Missouri also just kind of followed Vegas's lead and created their own Black Book for Missouri. And again, it was sort of dominated by Kansas City Mafia guys.
So did legalized gambling start in Atlantic City, and then move to Kansas City?
Well, legalized gaming actually came rather late to Atlantic City. It was already well established in Las Vegas and other parts of Nevada before it happened in Atlantic City. But after Atlantic City did legalize it in the 70s, then it really did start to catch on, and various cities like Kansas City, started legalizing it in certain areas, generally on the river, where you actually had to step offshore, so to speak. Even if the boat was tethered to shore, as long as you stepped on something that was floating on water, then you were okay.
And can you explain exactly why that law is the way it is for the riverboats here?
I don't know exactly why it is. Again, I think it's just
it's a loophole.
Right? It's a
right?
loophole. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah,
it really is. Gambling is not allowed in this state. But the river, it's a little different.
Yeah.
So
why do you think Kansas City, in the most simplest terms, why it became a hub for mafia? I mean, you would put it in the top 5 mafia cities at one point in time, maybe top 3.
I would definitely. New York. There's nothing like New York. New York has 5 families. Most other cities have 1 family. All other cities have 1 family, really. Sometimes they factionalize, but Chicago, enormous mafia presence in some ways. Many ways, I think Chicago had more power and influence than New York did. But right behind those two, Kansas City, Cleveland at one time was very influential. But I think Kansas City overall has a longer mob history than Cleveland. And the events that were happening here just really had a tremendous amount of impact nationally. And that started early, and it continues right up to contemporary times. Again, and we briefly mentioned those internet gambling cases that was in about 2010. And again, that was landmark stuff. It was the first, if I can remember correctly, based on what they found going on here with these guys in Kansas City. They passed new laws, to catch up with what was going on here in KC.
Do you think Kansas City became a hub because of what happened at the turn of the century with the Irish Catholics, and it was that kind of infrastructure, that lawlessness, and so they picked Kansas City?
Well, it could. Wild West really might have had a lot to do with it. I mean, you go back to the Wild West days, and there's a lot of the same stuff going on, right? We're talking gambling, we're talking prostitution, we're talking violence, gunplay, all those things. You had bandits on horseback instead of motorized mobsters, but a lot of it was going on. So from the very earliest days, Kansas City was just a pretty wild, gritty, raucous place.
Yeah.
And then you had the immigrations, waves of immigration from Ireland. Certainly there were Irish gangsters, no doubt about it, but for the most part their impact was more politics. But it bled over into organized crime. And then a little bit after the Irish, you had the Italians, in this case in KC, almost all Sicilian. And that's, of course, where the mafia really originated, was Sicily.
Yeah.
And vast majority of Sicilians who immigrated over here were honest, hardworking people, but that very unique tradition did make the journey with them, and it landed here too.
Yeah.
And at that time, Kansas City was a tough place. I mean, there was a lot of poverty, and a lot of people were really just doing whatever they could to scrape by and put food on the table that night.
Yeah.
If you didn't work, you didn't eat, and I think a lot of people turned to crime just as a means to stay alive. My
first, not interaction, but my first realization that the mafia is still out there, because I'm only 29, but when I was about 20, I was up at school at University of Rhode Island, and in a place called Newport, Rhode Island. It's one of the oldest towns in the whole country. And my buddy is working at a very popular, well-established bar up there. And we were hanging out. He's like, yeah, man, the owner got shook down tonight in the back room. I was like, yeah, it was just a typical shakedown. They come out, once a month or once every couple months. I'm like, what's a shakedown? He's like, the mafia, the mobsters, somebody we don't know comes by, chats with the owner, the bar owner in the back, and he gives them 10, 15% of the profits for that month. And this is 2011-ish, 2009-ish, when The Departed just came out too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
there was some connections between the Boston, whatever was going on in Boston, and Providence Mafia. And I'm like, oh my God, this shit's real.
Yeah.
It's actually still going on a little bit. So that's where I kind of initially got fascinated by it. And then I had no idea that Kansas City had any connection, because I grew up on the Kansas side, and we never talked about mobsters or mafia, and so I just think it's so interesting how it's all intertwined, and how geographically Kansas City became, in my opinion, the middle point between Vegas and New York.
Right.
And it seems like it was kind of the gateway, just like how it was the gateway for Pendergast and for the Wild West.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kansas City was the river city that opened up to the west side of the country, and it has that kind of same feel, geographically speaking.
It does. It's always been at a crossroads. That's why Union Station was so important. I mean, it was the midway point on the coast-to-coast journey. So by the time the trains got to KC, it was time to stop for a while. Mm-hmm. And the passengers would get off, and they were here in KC for a few days before their train continued on its way.
Yeah.
And so you had all kinds of people here from all over the country, even all over the world, stopping what they called the Paris of the Plains.
Yep.
And they'd get off the train. Maybe it was just for a few hours. Sometimes it was for a few days. And they would go to the restaurants. They would go to the nightclubs. They would go find the live jazz and listen to the live jazz. And it was kind of a remote frontier town, but at the same time, it was a cosmopolitan place because of that central location. Mm-hmm. And because of rail travel, really. That really made this town in many ways.
Yeah. Do you think the Kansas City Massacre was the biggest single biggest mob event for Kansas City in terms of, making headlines?
Probably. Of course, a lot of people would say the River Key, back in the much later period in the 1970s, that was huge. But yeah, I mean, I think so. The Union Station Massacre, the Kansas City Massacre was an enormous event. And we think of that as being ancient history. But, there's people in Kansas City today who are descended from a lot of the, from some of the policemen and the agents that were killed that day. And they still really feel it. It's still, this is still really raw for some of the sons and daughters of the men who were killed that day.
I was just there on Friday.
Yeah.
Put my finger in one of the bullet holes. I read the plaque. It's probably half the size of this board here.
Yeah.
And I was almost like, I guess there's two arguments for it, but I was like, man, it's for such a significant event, it's a really small plaque, but also, do you want a big plaque to
sort of romanticize it, or it was a tremendously important event in the history of law enforcement, because before that event, federal agents were not even allowed to carry weapons. They had no arrest authority even. And that single event changed all that. And it changed federal jurisdiction. All of a sudden, it opened up, and Congress gave federal law enforcement authority that they never had to investigate certain crimes that before they never could. Now federal law enforcement is just a huge, gigantic monster. It's just a big thing. And
so you think that event was a tipping point for
absolutely.
What the police and militarized police are today?
Not something talk about police, you're thinking more like local departments, but the modern FBI, absolutely.
Like SWAT and things like that?
SWAT, maybe, probably to some extent, but really just like the modern FBI, is traceable directly to the Kansas City Massacre.
And can you get into the details exactly why that was? Maybe some people don't know.
Well, it's so that event is so. It would take too much. You have to read the book. It's not an easy.
Oh, I know.
Answer,
It's
right?
a whole chapter almost, isn't it?
And there's so much going on. There's events overlapping each other, but there were these. This is interesting too about Kansas City. Kansas City was the one place where the fortunes of the mafia intersected with the fortunes of the what you might call the desperado gangsters or the public enemies. I'm talking about more rural outlaws who were very, very well known in those days. Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, people like that. So the Union Station Massacre was sort of the intersection of the mafia and the rural outlaws, and that talk about a volatile combustion.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so federal law enforcement, FBI, was trying to transport a prisoner from Hot Springs, Arkansas to Kansas City, and this prisoner he was in tight with a lot of those rural outlaws. He was one himself.
What was his name again?
His name was Frank Nash.
That's, yeah.
Frank Nash, and his buddy Vern Miller, who had a very interesting history himself, was trying to rescue him. They were so bold back in those days, those type of outlaws. I mean, they committed crimes like crazy, shooting up banks, shooting it out with cops, hightailing it across the county line to safety. Just horrible people. I mean, there's no gangster alive today that was equal to them. I mean, I'm not saying they were better or worse, but they were every bit as ruthless as any hardcore gangster today. And anyway, they figured, oh, well, hell, we'll just march right in and rescue our buddy Frank Nash.
Yeah, they've probably done it before.
They figured the FBI wouldn't be carrying guns, okay, because they didn't even have that authority. And they took some Thompson submachine guns down to Union Station, and they were ready to just shoot the agents if they had to and spring their buddy. And it turned into chaos. It turns out the agents were armed because they had gone in the company of a couple of local police here from KC and also a detective out of Oklahoma. And this detective out of Oklahoma had extra weapons, and the agents just took them just to be safe because they knew they were dealing with some real bad people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, confusion ensued, and all kinds of shots were fired. I believe I know the two KC officers were killed. One of the FBI agents was killed. The other FBI agent was badly wounded. Everybody was at least badly wounded that day. Yeah, and Frank Nash himself was killed in the confusion. So,
what year was this?
This Union Station Massacre was was it 33?
Sorry.
It was either 33 or 36.
Okay, when was Bonnie and Clyde?
Pretty sure it was 33. That was the same time period. Bonnie and Clyde were killed just out by the KC airport, just within a couple of months of the Union Station Massacre.
Yeah, I just watched a movie on Netflix called The Highwaymen.
Mm-hmm.
It follows the two Texas Rangers that were chasing down Bonnie and Clyde and where they killed them, and they put, I don't know, a couple hundred bullets in the car.
Yeah.
And and they show the car and it's all riddled, and it looks like the same scene from the Union Station Massacre.
Mm-hmm.
And so it had to have been the same time frame because that's when they both just started to arm themselves, the police.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting connection there. Talk about the double murder at the KC Club. I don't know really anything about that.
Yeah, the double murder at the Democratic Club. Again, just like the Union Station Massacre, this was an event that just had national reverberations.
Was this
that
after?
affected this was in 1950.
Okay.
And at that time, the Kansas City Mafia was so bold that they figured that they could make Kansas City, that they could the objective was to legalize gambling all over Missouri. And the man to do that was Charles Binaggio. And he was, at that time, the boss of the Kansas City mob. And he was a pretty slick character. He was like Johnny Lazia before him. He was well dressed. He was well spoken. He came off as more like a businessman. He could walk into any room and nobody would ever think there's a gangster. Rather polished gentleman in many ways. Very politically savvy also. Very politically savvy. He controlled a lot of votes. He was able to deliver elections He was able to get people elected. He had friends in the state house in Jefferson City that would do all kinds of big favors for him, etc., etc. But at that time, he convinced the national syndicate, New York, Chicago, everybody, that if they would invest in Kansas City, he was going to open up the entire state to legalize gambling. And all his mob associates from all over the country would have first dibs on all of that. And that was the plan. And they were well on their way to achieving that goal, maybe, when things started to go south for Charlie. He was under a lot of heat from federal investigations. Actually, it might have been state investigations at that time, or it might have been both. But things went bad. Let's put it that way. A lot of powerful mobsters from other cities had invested in him, and when it became apparent that this was not going to happen, then the writing was on the wall that Charlie's days were numbered. He eventually was killed with his trusted associate, right-hand man, Charlie Gargata. And this happened at the North Side Democratic Club on Truman Road. Okay, so Truman was president at the time, and they had just renamed that road Truman Road. And there was a big picture of Harry Truman in the Democratic Club. So they had a meeting there. It was somebody they trusted that shot and killed them both, Gargata and Binaggio. And there was this famous picture, it's in the book, of big portrait of Harry Truman looking down at the corpse of Charlie Gargata sprawled on the floor with a pool of blood coming out of his head. And that picture ended up in newspapers all over the country. And the implication of the picture, the symbolism of the picture, was that Harry Truman, Kansas City Machine, Tom Pendergast, looking down at this murder scene of mobsters, so it was a nightmare for Democrats everywhere. And it had a lot of political implications. But that event changed history also.
Was Truman president?
He was president at that time, right.
That's heavy.
It was heavy. It was very heavy. And it was so heavy that it led to the Kefauver investigations, which was this enormous investigation spanned a couple of years, I think, at least a year. And Estes Kefauver, who was a powerful senator out of Tennessee, he toured the country holding hearings all over, subpoenaed all these mobsters from all the different cities in, and gave them the third degree and questioned them on this and that. Most of them took the fifth. And all this was televised. It was all televised. And TV was brand new at that time. Mm-hmm. And everybody around the country was purchasing televisions. And one of the very first big televised events were these Kefauver hearings. And people were just amazed and fascinated with the underworld and this thing that wasn't even really known as the Mafia yet. Nobody really understood quite what it was. It was very mysterious. And yet here were the biggest mobsters in the country being grilled on national television. Now, unfortunately, Kansas City, they came here first. And it was right before they started televising it. So we don't have any we don't have those videos, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But there was this moment, and again, it's in the book, where the boss of the family at that time was named Tony Gizzo. And I used to always say everybody, every Mafia family, Mafia has a lot of rules, right? You don't mess around with another member's wife, no facial hair, a lot of, you can't do this, can do that, have to do this, can't do that. Tons of rules. I used to always joke that one of the rules was every family has to have a guy named Fat Tony. But and we did, Fat Tony Gizzo. And they had Kefauver, it's the panel of senators and congressmen, whoever was, on the panel, asked him how much money he carried on his person. He said, "You want to see it?" And he whipped out this big roll of cash and started counting out his cash, So that was a funny moment. But again, the point is that, events here reverberated all over the nation and affected what happened in Kansas City. Generally, a lot of times affected the entire underworld. And again, this is why it's so important historically, what happened here.
How involved was Truman? How corrupt was Truman?
Truman was not corrupt. If somebody out there has any evidence or documentation that he was, fine, bring it on. But good luck, because it's been tried. And he's withstood all scrutiny for corruption. He was part of the Pendergast machine. So everybody assumed he was corrupt. But he wasn't. I mean, there were, individuals who were involved in the machine that were not corrupt. And Truman was one of them. Very honest man. He considered Tom Pendergast a dear friend. He knew that he owed his entire political career to Tom Pendergast. Harry Truman would never have been the president without Tom Pendergast. Would have never gotten elected to the Senate without Tom Pendergast. In fact, and this is something I think says a lot about Truman, the kind of guy he was. When Tom Pendergast died, Truman was vice president. He got the news that Pendergast was dead. He said, well, I'm going to go to the funeral. Don't do it, Mr. President. Don't. His closest advisors, everybody said, no, do not go to Tom Pendergast.
It's going to look
big
shady
mistake,
as hell.
Big mistake. Don't do it. Not one single person advised him that would be okay. Everybody, from his family to his closest associates to the most powerful people in the country, they almost forbade him from going to the funeral. He said, look, he's my friend. He might have been corrupt, he might have been this, he might have been that, but he was my friend. He did a lot for me, and I've got to pay my respects. So he hitched a ride on an army bomber that was coming back here anyway.
Yeah.
And he went to the funeral. And I just think that I like, Harry Truman, this is a picture of Harry Truman. Says, kindest regards to Frank Hayde from Harry Truman, Independence, Missouri, December 17th, 1954. So I'm not that old.
Yeah. That's your grandfather?
That's my grandfather.
Okay.
So my family is definitely biased towards Truman. We have been since my grandfather. My grandfather admired him more than any other public figure. And I think his reputation has really stood the test of time. A lot of people, historians, when they write about Truman, they write about an honest, plain-spoken man from Missouri who never went to college, but was probably better educated than most college graduates, just having read so much on his own and having learned so much in the life that he lived.
Yeah. I remember a portion of the book, they were saying how smart the mobsters were, that most of them could run big companies. There the hidden messages and the accounting and the bookkeeping and how everything was so intricate and how they ran it like a well-oiled company.
Yeah. I wouldn't say most of them because, but most of the hierarchy, the upper echelon, certainly were smart men. There was a lot of dumb thugs working at the lower levels for sure, and even some of the guys who rose up top, weren't that smart. But most of them were at least shrewd in certain ways. And Carl DeLuna is a good example. He was still alive when I wrote my book. He was the only one I was a little bit concerned about. He was an old man at the time, but he was a tough guy for sure. Very tough guy that nobody messed with Carl DeLuna. But he wasn't like he was a smart guy.
Yeah.
And he was the one who was in charge of managing all the money that was coming out of Las Vegas. Money would come from Las Vegas to Kansas City, and then it would get dispersed to Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago, the other Midwestern crime families. And Carl DeLuna was in charge of all that. And he kept a lot of, unfortunately for him, he kept some written records on that. And, when the FBI seized those with the search warrant, that got him into some pretty big trouble. But he managed a lot of these. It's true. And that's one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of these guys couldn't have applied their talents to legitimate business because they probably could have done very well. Yeah.
Have you had any of the family names? You mentioned 100 of them in the book. Have you had any of their offspring that are younger that have reached out, asking for more information, curious?
Yeah, I have. When the book first came out, I did quite a few events around town, book signings and that kind of thing, and I was, someone would walk up, let's say Joe DiGiovanni, for example. Guy came up and put out his hand and said, "I'm Joe DiGiovanni." I said, "Wow." That's his grandfather on the cover of the book there. And other people a lot of people who were connected or who were, like you said, maybe the grandson or granddaughter of somebody in the book. And it's encouraging to see that most of the people have moved on. A lot of the mobsters didn't want this for their kids. This is the life they chose. They came up in poverty. They came out of the North End when it was a virtual ghetto, and they prospered enough to send their kids to private schools and give them good educations and church on Sunday and stable family lives. And they've moved on, and now you've got all kinds of descendants of these people who are major contributors in this city, in business, in government, in education.
Yeah. Do you think? Do you like seeing like? You have Tomstown, obviously Pendergast. Then there's another. I saw one in the Crossroads I think it was called Lazio. It's a bar.
Yeah, Lansky-as. Yeah.
Lansky-as. Do you like seeing kind of?
I do. I think it's it's history, and there is a fine line. You have to be careful. You don't want to romanticize or glorify violence, and I mean the events in here. None of them are glorified. I mean, none of them are they all happened exactly like I told them, and I didn't romanticize them. But I suppose I could be accused of promoting or glorifying that history, that life. But it really happened. I'm not making anything up.
Right.
I'm not exaggerating anything. And this did really happen. And history, whether it's organized crime or whether it's any type of history, all history is filled with deceit and violence and all kinds of things. That is the stuff of life, and that is history. So you can't just avoid talking about it. You can't just sweep it under the rug.
Yeah.
There are some people out there who don't want have any association with the mafia. Kansas, for a long time, mainstream person in Kansas City was not proud of this. They did want to sweep it under the rug. That's when it was still happening. I mean, like in the 70s during the River Key, when buildings were blowing up and guys were getting shot and bombs were going off all the time, dead bodies in car trunks and all that. By and large, most citizens in KC were not proud of this at all and did not want the rest of the country to know that this was a mafia town. But by the time my book was, by the time it was published in 2007, again, it was enough time had passed that you can look back, sort of like you look back at the Wild West. It's history.
Yeah.
But I did have some concerns about that. I asked myself many times as I was writing, am I glorifying this? And I wanted to be very careful and not do that. I'm a law enforcement officer myself, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
So part of that was writing about the agents and the law enforcement, officers who did extraordinary work, groundbreaking work to penetrate the mob and to come up with all kinds of innovative ways to investigate them and to prosecute them and to basically lead to the end of it all. I mean, again, there's remnants of it today, but the work that that federal law enforcement and local law enforcement, the strike force, organized crime strike force, which is made up of both federal and local and state, the work that they did in the 70s and 80s, was just incredible. It really was.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How has the book evolved from when it came out to now? Like, do you have plans for another one?
Well, the
add-ons?
book, it's been very popular, and it's sold 14,000 copies.
Wow.
Which for a independently published book, I'm not a professional writer. I don't have an agent.
Yeah.
And the publisher Barricade Books is what you would call an independent publisher. They've published a lot of books. They have a good reputation. But again, they're small. They're out of New Jersey. So 14,000 copies is pretty good. Barricade is thrilled with the success of that book. Again, when it came out, I mean, the city was so hungry for this history. Everywhere I went to do signings, whatever, again, and it didn't matter if the people were connected to individuals in the book. They were glad it was out there. They wanted to read about it. I mean, these are exciting events. This is some really interesting history. So, and then again, there's readers outside of Kansas City, maybe never even set foot in Kansas City, but they want to read anything and everything about the mafia. They can't get enough of it. So I knew it was going to be popular, and it turned out it was. It's still in print 10, 11 years later. So real happy about that. And that did lead to this book, The Italian Gardens, the history of Kansas City through its favorite restaurant. So the DiCapo family, who ran Italian Gardens for generations, they read Mafia and the Machine. They liked it a lot. They hired me to work with them on this book. And this is a great book because, I mean, the Italian-American experience in Kansas City is so rich.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much history there. And this book, it really covers all of it. You know, I'm talking about everything from boxing to baseball to business to music and performing arts and everything, fine food, you know, all that stuff. Prominent citizens, celebrities from all over the country come into this restaurant at 12th and Baltimore. It was a Kansas City institution for, I think it was 86 years or something that they were there. And again, back to the time when people traveled by train, you know, and they would step off the train, and Italian Gardens was one of those places where everybody would go. And they welcomed everybody. Plumbers and famous opera singers sat right next to each other. And the food was affordable, but it was good. And everybody went there. Everybody knew it. So this book is great, and it's got all kinds of pictures and fun facts. It has a list in the back of I think it's 2,000 some odd names of Kansas Cityans, some very well known, very prominent, famous, others just ordinary people who were part of this thing called the Sa Benedica Club. And if they liked you at Italian Gardens, you might get lucky and get initiated into the Sa Benedica Club.
Okay.
That meant you got to sit at the Sa Benedica table, which was a prominent table in the restaurant. Saturn's all men. It was a men's only club. And if you sat at the Sa Benedica table, you never knew who was going to be sitting across from you. It could be someone really famous, could be the mayor, it could be city council member, you know, it could be the guy who you're hoping will give you a job. So it was kind of an honor, you know.
Yeah.
And you get a little card you could carry in your wallet, you know, lifetime member, Sa Benedica Club.
That's great.
It's the kind of thing they did. And
It's neat.
so this book is self-published and getting to be kind of a collector's item now.
When did that restaurant shut down?
Let's see, when did they shut down? I believe it was about 2003, right about 2003, I think.
Did you ever eat there?
Long time ago. Yeah,
What's
when I was young.
Yeah.
I don't even really remember it. That's how young I
Yeah,
was. But my parents, you know, would go there. My father went there for back in the old days. I mean, my dad's been going there since the 40s. Well, he was, you know, they're not open anymore. But yeah.
What's your favorite Italian restaurant in Kansas City now?
God, there's so many good ones. There really are. Anthony's is good. They've got some great sauce.
Yeah. I like the Italian Hero at Jasper's Marco Polo.
Oh, yeah.
This is my favorite sandwich in Kansas City.
I used to love Marco Polo used to make this white clam pizza. I don't know if they're still making that.
I don't know.
That was good.
No, I'll have to check next time.
Yeah.
Well, cool, man. What is there anything else you want to share or get out there?
Well, you know, one interesting story about this Italian Gardens book, it's kind of neat, again, just because I'm so proud of my Kansas City history and Kansas City heritage with my family. When we started working on this, Carl DiCapo, he started going through the old ledger, that the pages are all yellow and they're crumbling, you know, of the Sa Benedica Club, because when they made you a member, they would sign your name in this ledger. And he started going through it in preparation for this book, and he's looking through the very earliest pages of it, and he comes across Frank Hayde. I said, Frank, hey, that's who's working on our book with us. Again, that was my grandfather.
That's awesome.
And nobody knew it, you know, that he had been part of that. Well, my dad had remembered that, but that was kind of neat, you know, one of those serendipitous things that, you know, when you live here, it's great because it's an awesome city and it's big and it's cosmopolitan, but it's also kind of a small town. This
is more of a town.
Yeah,
for sure. You know, I like it like that because I think you can build a good reputation or a bad one.
Right.
But I think it's great for business because if you do good business and you operate more morally and ethically the right way, it spreads. And that's cool to have in a city like this, and you might not get that in much bigger cities. But man, I really appreciate you sharing your story. That's really
I'm
cool. I mean,
honored that you guys had me. It's been,
Yeah.
it's been a good 10 years since the book came out. So for me to be able to continue to talk about it and promote it a little,
Yeah.
and
Any
just talk about
future,
Kansas City
Yeah,
is
for
a
sure.
wonderful thing.
Any interest of doing another Mafia book or?
I always have some ideas. Right now, I'm not currently working on anything. I did come out with Stan Levy, jazz heavyweight, a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Stan Levy was a famous jazz drummer, not well known outside of jazz, but within jazz, he's very well known. And he was also a heavyweight boxer, if you can believe that, early in his career. So he had both things going on. So he had an
Wow.
interesting life. But there's a lot of Kansas City in this book
Okay.
because he was closely associated with Charlie Parker.
Okay.
He helped Charlie Parker develop bebop, this revolutionary music that changed music forever. And so there's a lot here in this book about the jam sessions of Kansas City, what the jazz scene was like when Charlie Parker was just coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very exciting history for me, too. The jazz history of Kansas City, to me, is almost just as interesting as the Mafia history.
Mm-hmm.
So many great jazz players came out of this town. And the type of music that happened here, the type of music that was created here, influenced jazz in the same way that the events in the Mafia influenced the rest of the country. So again, it's just one of those things. And again, those two were connected, of course, very closely connected. Jazz and the Mafia were very connected. Who owned the jazz clubs back then in Kansas City? Mobsters did, for the most part. Who was bringing the heroin into the clubs that the musicians were using? Mafia was.
Yeah.
Charlie Parker got hooked on Mafia heroin when he was a young boy.
Wow.
And then he got Stan Levy hooked on the
Really?
stuff. Yeah. But so there's some dark history there too.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the jazz history is just exciting. It's positive, and I wish that's one area where I wish that Kansas City would take more ownership of the jazz heritage that we have here.
It's
because
grown tremendously. I lived downtown in 2014, and that was the first time I'd been to the Green Lady Lounge in the Phoenix.
Yeah.
And it was Friday night, Saturday night, decent showing. You go down there now, and you can hardly find a table.
That's great.
And so just in, 5 years, I mean, I've seen it grow exponentially.
Yeah.
You ever been to a place called, I think it's either called the Foundry or the Foundation?
Mm-hmm. A Foundry, I think.
It opens at 2 a.m.
Wow, I haven't been there.
Yeah, you walk upstairs, opens up I think at 1:30 or 2 a.m. They serve a little fried fish cart right outside. It's over right next to 18th and Vine, and they got like old school chairs, and you go in and people just jam.
Yeah.
It's basically like an open jam
Yeah,
session.
nice.
So if you're ever trying to tie one on late one night,
Yeah.
you should check that place out.
I will.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's very unique.
Thanks for the tip. I
Yeah.
will. And one tip back at you is you got to catch Bobby Watson.
Okay.
Got to catch Kansas City institution. Just have done so much for jazz. One of the most prominent living jazz players alive, in my opinion. A lot of people would agree with that.
Does he
And
play
he's right here. He lives here in the city.
Yeah.
He lived in New York for many years. So it was an important part of that scene there. But he came back quite a few years ago, and he runs the jazz studies program at UMKC.
Okay.
But, I mean, talk about a heavyweight talent. And I'm always surprised at how many Kansas Cityans have not gone to catch Bobby Watson live because he's here and he's available. And it's just like, I mean, hey,
Yeah.
take advantage of it, while
I
you
need
still
to.
can.
I was not aware of him.
Yeah, Bobby Watson, check him out.
Sweet. Awesome, man.
Hey,
great.
thanks, Peyton.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you
Yeah.
having me.
Really, thanks for coming on.
And give my best to your sister.
I will.
Yeah.
I will. Make sure to do that.
Definitely.
Awesome. Thanks, bro.